have a look at the market, and I'll start with cashew kernels. There hasn't been a great deal of change over the past couple of weeks since we were together last. The market's been a little bit quieter than it had been in the previous 2 weeks. I'm really talking there about the international kernels market, mainly sales from Vietnam. Demand's steady, but there hasn't really been the kind of follow through that sometimes we've seen in the past. Trade statistics remain really strong, just about everywhere. I was looking at India's kernels exports. India isn't a huge exporter of kernels anymore, but even India's kernels exports are up 4% this year now by the end of August. About 30,000 tons exported over the first 8 months of the year. So that looks really positive, more of that later. Prices though are not moving, and I suppose that's the real issue for processors now, and I suppose in a way for buyers of kernels too. We are seeing this wider range. Still, some importers, particularly in the US, are offering really competitive prices into their market, and we're just not seeing any movement on kernels prices after that firming that we saw in the early part of September. So where are we on prices? Let's remind ourselves. As you can see, the prices are still, although a little bit firmer, there's no real sign of volatility. We've seen a very stable pattern over the past few weeks. The gap from the lower end to the higher end, so from the small processors for prompt positions, maybe with lower food safety certifications, the gap from those guys to the big processors forward positions has widened a little bit, and the gap between the holes and the brokens has got a little bit wider. Not really noticeable on the chart, but it has gotten a little bit wider. So I think that sometimes we can take those two factors as indications that some price change might be ahead, but right now we're not seeing anything to suggest that that's going to happen today or tomorrow or next week or even this month. When we look at the overall positioning of prices, we're still at or around the 2-year lows. Now, I know that there were prices below the current levels traded, but I try to work off the better processors on a 3-month forward position to try and give us a constant when we measure where price is. So that means we are at about the 2-year lows. We're 9% below the 2-year average. That's quite significant. And we're 19% below the 2-year high. And that's also quite significant. So what does it mean? Well, it certainly means that most contracts are concluded above today's market. Certainly any contract that was done forward. But there would be many contracts done in the last weeks and in the spring that would be in or around about today's prices. And that can be significant in the future, especially if we start to see volatility in the cashew price. It also means that buyers can buy at very attractive prices. By any measure, the current cashew prices are really, really attractive. Can a buyer buy them and resell them and make a profit? Probably. Is it likely that the price 6 months from now will be higher? Probably. Are these prices historically at levels that would have in the past justified making a purchase? Certainly. But buyers may not see a reason to make a move just yet. And I think that's part of the reason that we're going to talk about as to why prices haven't moved so far. So let's have a look at some of the trade figures, some of the stats and some of the talk on the market. We start in Vietnam. So when we're talking about international trade in cashew kernels, Vietnam is always the place to start. In 2022, Vietnam supplied about 57% of the internationally traded cashew kernels. It supplied 89% of the United States imports and 76% of the European Union imports. And those two markets come second and third in the world for consumption of cashews after India. So looking at Vietnam's exports so far, it's record-breaking performance. That's all we can say. As at the end of September, the figure exceeds any other 9-month period in the history of the Vietnamese cashew industry. So a new record there. And the interesting thing, or one of the interesting things, is that it's quite positive right across all of the destination markets. So we can see at the lower end of the scale, shipments. So we're talking now the increase in shipments from Vietnam in 2023 over the figures for the same period last year, 2022. So we can see that the US and Canada combined are up 8%, Europe is up 7%, and then we get into some fairly remarkable numbers. Shipments to the top 5 importers in the Middle East are up 35%, and to China, in what is becoming more and more significant in terms of demand, particularly for Vietnam, shipments to China are up 39% on where they were this time last year. Rest of Asia really moving into the cashew sphere, and we have to say that the future of demand is probably in Asia. And when we look at the top 11 countries in Asia outside of China, we see 17% growth. So every month since last March has been a new record for export shipments from Vietnam, and that points to a new record this year. That's not something that anyone would have expected. We might have expected a recovery in shipments and exports this year compared to last year. Bear in mind, last year shipments were good in the first half of the year, but particularly to the Western countries in the second half, they literally fell off the chart. July, August onwards, really strongly down. We expected a recovery this year. We've seen that recovery. We didn't quite expect the kind of increase in exports to Asian countries that we've seen over the first 9 months of this year, and that's really positive for the market generally. Let's have a look at some of the countries. So we'll just take a kind of big picture approach here, and we'll have a look at some of the highlights of demand so far this year in the various countries. So let's start in Asia. India. Now, outside India, we see Indian demand expressed as imports of raw cashew nuts. When I talk about consumption in India, I'm not talking about RCN imports. I will talk about those shortly. We're talking about consumption in the country. Big country, huge consumer, and we're seeing quite strong consumption. That is always just based on reports, conversations, what they call anecdotal evidence. We don't have statistical evidence on India, but we will be able to calculate as we get to the end of the year the net disappearance. So very strong so far in India. China, well, as I've said, by the end of August, China had imported as much as it has imported in all of 2022. And that's really good news for business generally. In Japan, shipments are up 30% from Vietnam, which is also very encouraging. And I checked shipments from India, and shipments from India are not especially down to Japan. So it is a net increase. It's not just a replacement of cargo that was previously coming from somewhere else. Just took Australia as an example of another Asian country. Australian shipments from Vietnam up by 7% already this year. So there could be seasonal factors in some of this. There could also be seasonal factors in the Middle East, where we've said shipments are up by 30% from Vietnam. But generally speaking, it does look extremely positive in the Asian markets. If we look in Europe, I might say it's a little bit less positive, but this is much more in line with what we expected this year for the European market. So overall, official figures to the end of July show imports up by about 3% for the European Union and the UK combined. You have to be careful when you look at import figures in Europe, because it also includes trade between European countries, and that has to be excluded. So if you come up with a bigger number, you might just find some of it's intra-Europe trade. So this is the figure for imports from outside. and it's up 3%. But if we look at shipments, so now we're talking about what's been shipped from Vietnam and may not be in the import figures in Europe so far. But shipments to Germany up 15%, France up 17%, the UK up 15%, and the Netherlands, which would be the biggest importing destination as the receiving and redistribution country for most of the cashew kernels, that's up 6%. So the comment would be that shipments are running ahead of imports. That's a signal that the second half of the year we'll see an overall improvement, and it wouldn't be surprising if that import figure of plus 3% finished the year maybe at 5%, 6% up, based on the figures that we have right now. Looking at the African perspective, by the end of July, imports into the EU and UK had reached 70% of the 2022 total. So again, well ahead for Africa. There's growth there. Côte d'Ivoire in particular is growing in its shipments to the European market. Pretty positive news. North America. Well, there is a little bit of positive news, or more positive news coming in the last couple of months. July imports into the US were up by 25% on last year, and August by a similar figure. Now, we would have to say that July and August last year were quite disappointing. Let's look at shipments from Vietnam. So all shipments between January and September from Vietnam with North American destinations are 8% up. This is looking, again, quite positive, but certainly the US market is recovering or coming back to growth in demand a little bit slower than other markets. Overall imports for the year are still down 10%. That looks a lot better than it did 3 months ago when the figure was minus 17%. And I've started now to look more and more at the imports of processed cashews. So we're talking about roasted and salted cashews, we're talking about roasted cashews, we're talking about consumer packed cashews. That figure is about 20,000 tons so far this year, and that's about 5% up on last year. So we're seeing, generally speaking, across the world, very positive statistics for trade, much better than last year, and some of the figures are better than 2021. Asian figures generally better than 2021. Europe and the US, Canada still lagging a little bit on the 2021 figures, and in the case of North America, still below last year, but all seems to be moving in a positive direction. So let's switch to raw cashew nuts for a moment and just see if we can get a snapshot picture of the situation across the world. Some of you will be very familiar with this. For others, it's not something they look at too regularly. So we've basically finished the West African season. The East African season is upon us. It's going to start with the auctions in Tanzania on Friday, and in November, the Mozambique season will open. So let's have a look at where we are as that comes upon us. First of all, in Vietnam, imports strong this year. Imports of raw cashew nuts very strong this year, up 40%. And that's despite a fall in imports from Cambodia. Exports, as I was saying, very strong. In the last month, the exports slightly exceeded imports, but not by much, which means that the stocks are slightly lower, but stocks are pretty good in Vietnam. I don't think there's any urgent need for Vietnamese buyers to procure raw cashew nuts from outside the country. If we look in India, again, imports are strong. The figures for the end of August, 868,000 tons of raw cashew nuts imported. Okay, that looks much lower than last year. That's about 200,000 tons less than the same time last year. But if we go back to 2021, or any other year on record, 2023 is higher. The only year that's higher than 2023 is last year. And don't forget, last year resulted in a big carry-in. So again, it seems to me that the stocks available What's been imported are pretty stable, pretty good in India, not a huge urgency there. I'm pretty sure Indian buyers will need to come to East Africa eventually to buy some raw cashew nuts, but I wouldn't say they're under too much pressure at this moment in time. East Africa, crop outlook is good. I'm not going to talk about it. We're going to hear from our guests shortly on the crops and the situation in East Africa. West Africa, shipments are really, really strong this year. There are some balances around, probably Guinea-Bissau, for example, 30 to 40,000 tons as mentioned. But if we look at shipments from Côte d'Ivoire, if we look at Vietnam's import side, so this is what's arrived and been custom cleared in Vietnam, they're reporting 700,000 tons. India's reporting 142,000 tons. That's a total of 842,000 tons. So take that, add what's likely to be processed this year, and we're well into the Ivorian crop. And if we look at Ghana, we can see that Ghanaian exports this year are very strong too, 200,000 tons to India, more than that to Vietnam. So clearly, a lot of material is arriving from Ghana, probably into Vietnam and from Ghanaian ports, but it may not be Ghanaian raw cashew nuts. That is an issue that's authorities both sides in Ghana and Côte d'Ivoire are well aware of. So I think when we can add some of those Ghanaian imports, especially into Vietnam, to the Ivorian figures, and that suggests that we are well on the way to the Côte d'Ivoire and Ghana crop, and probably other origins in the region included in those numbers, well ahead of the curve. Unlikely that we're going to see big stocks left in West Africa this year. Look at Nigeria, 233,000 tons reported by Vietnam as imported, 63,000 tons by India. Essentially, the crop is gone. Probably some material from Benin perhaps included in there, but certainly that crop is gone. And looking at those figures, you'd be relatively optimistic that by the end of the year, all of the stocks in West Africa will be gone. Brazil, we had the crop forecast, it hasn't changed. We mentioned it last week, around 127,000 tons, a bit like 2021, not as good as 2022. So let's ask the question, if demand is improving, why are prices not moving up? And I'm going to look at it from 2 points of view. Let's, from a buyer's point of view, from a cashew kernels buyer's point of view, they might say, well, why should we act? Prices are still low, they haven't moved up, we're still seeing plenty of offers. There's no incentive for us to take any action right now. We'll do what we have to, but no more than that. They might also say that supply still easily meets demand. If we look at it in the matrix, supply-demand balance, they would probably be right on that. They might also say, well, you know, we're not really that certain about what's happening. Maybe the whole economic situation does look a little bit better. And here we might be talking about the United States in particular. But there is a lot of uncertainty. There's uncertainty about inflation, there's uncertainty about recession, and that would also apply to China. So that's going to hold buyers back, you might imagine. And finally, they might be saying, well, look, if the price does go up, it creates a lot of risk. And there might be a risk of defaults. So why would we want to upset this situation right now? Even if we weren't uncertain, even if we didn't feel supply was going to meet demand, and even if we didn't think prices are going to stay stable for the coming weeks. So it is a difficult puzzle from the buyer's point of view. And we should ask the question always, whose interest is it in that kernels prices might rise? And it really isn't. I mean, outside of India, there really isn't a great deal of value for anyone in kernels prices rising right now. Simply on the basis that processors generally tend not to speculate at this time of year. So they're not going to gain by prices going up. Consumers certainly aren't going to gain by prices going up. But in the longer term, processors might have a different perspective. So let's think about their perspective for a moment. So first thing for processors, and now we're looking really at Vietnamese processors. We might be looking at some of the smaller processors, and we might be saying two things. First of all, they need to keep generating cash. So the only way to generate cash is to sell. If you have stock, it also allows you, if your credit is restricted, it allows you to regenerate new raw material so that you can sell again, so that you can stay in business, and so that you can remain active. Now, if you didn't make forward sales, obviously you need to sell as well, and that is time bound. So as you process, you must sell. And maybe this is one of the reasons why we continually see a list of processors offering October, November, December, early 2024 shipping positions, simply because they need to sell, they need to stay in business, they need to keep turning over their business. And there's nothing wrong with that. Secondly, there's plenty of raw cashew nuts around. There's plenty of stock in Vietnam. So they know as they sell, they can replace, and as long as they can replace at some kind of a calculation, they're going to do that. And they might also say, and this is maybe where I would have a little bit of an argument with some of the processors in Vietnam, they might say that the market's been at low prices forever, for as long as we can remember. For 2 years now, we've been at low prices. And that's true, we have. Whether we need to be at low prices or not is entirely another matter. And I think to a certain extent we might say that this is a little bit of a circular argument. We're at low prices because we're at low prices, and we're at low prices because we panicked about 2 years ago and got this completely wrong and drove prices much lower than they needed to be. But that's where it is now, and it is going to be difficult for this market to move off the current low prices. So we're around about the lows. These are around about the lows of 12 years, and it's been there for a long time. And it could be there for another while. But are they right? Are they right when they say that? Let's have a look at some of the factors. So first of all, there's no doubt supply does meet demand right now. Maybe not November, December, but certainly if we look at the whole year and we look at what's available, what's in stock, what's imported versus what's needed, yeah, supply meets demand. Secondly, for sure, prices have been low for a long time. Look at this chart. We're really looking back quite a long time. And prices have been on a decline. It's now slowed or stopped. But would you rule out another period of stable prices around these current levels? It'd be a brave commentator who would do that. So, counter argument might be, well, look, supply does meet demand, but that's already factored into the prices. The market has already adjusted to the current supply and demand situation. Secondly, yeah, we agree. There are strong imports, meaning that the raw cashew nut stocks are mainly at destination. That's for sure. But that also means that they're in relatively strong hands. And we've seen over the last few weeks that raw cashew nut prices, although there hasn't been much trade, and although there is plenty of stock available in both the big processing countries, we haven't seen any real pressure on prices of raw cashew nuts. And there's not much chance of that happening in the coming weeks and probably in the coming months, because we're now at a time of year when there's much less harvesting going on than there would be in the period from March through to June. Third argument might be, well, supply could get worse. It's not going to get much better. We know that, not between now and the new crop in the Northern Hemisphere, but it could get worse. So there are risk factors. There's a lot of talk about El Nino. There's a lot of impact of El Nino. It is real. It is having a significant impact on weather right across the planet. Look at the monsoon in India. look at some of the weather conditions in Europe, look at some of the weather events in the United States. It is having an impact. It could have an impact in Southeast Asia on cashews. That would be the next time that we could see a major impact of El Nino, looking at flowering in particular in Cambodia and Vietnam. Later, it could influence India, but that wouldn't be until into the first quarter of next year. So supply can get worse. I think that's reasonable to say. We're going to hear shortly about the situation in East Africa, but it certainly looks pretty good this year from what I understand. Fourth factor, demand is improving. So we see counter arguments. We see, yeah, supply does meet demand. Yes, prices have been low for a long time. But some of those things are already factored into the market, and some of them are changing, and some of them are risk factors that we might see happen over the next couple of months. And that's what we need to watch. So we need to watch the situation as it develops in East Africa. We need to watch the situation in Southeast Asia, followed on then by the general Northern Hemisphere, India, and eventually West Africa crop development situation. We know about Brazil. We know roughly about East Africa. We're still asking the question, are they right when they say that there's no reason to move at the moment? A couple of factors. Inflation, certainly easing a little bit. Certainly it'll be lower in 2023 than 2022 and is forecast to be lower again in 2024. But the uncertainty persists. Buyers are unlikely in those conditions to take risks. So they'll buy what they need, but not much more than that. Inflation is stubborn. Inflation, particularly in countries like Germany, is hanging around longer than may be expected. Demand in those countries is also improving, and that's another little bit of a puzzle. So in the past, we used to say that in times of recession, demand for snack foods was strong. We didn't see that this time. We saw that the same amount of money was spent, and even more was spent on snack foods in Europe, for example, but the volume was significantly reduced. Costs were higher. Energy, transport, labor, packaging, all of these costs were higher. Raw material prices were lower. Cashew kernels were lower. But value sales stayed quite strong this year, but volumes were down. So far, that appears to be changing when we look at the import figures. Second factor is from the processors' point of view, processors have been struggling. Profit margins have been poor for some time. I think that probably applies right across the sector. The relationship between raw cashew nut prices and kernels prices hasn't been ideal for processing, and it should. But on the other hand, we're likely to see competition between India and Vietnam for supply of raw cashew nuts. We're likely to see that continue, and that is one of the things that's holding up raw cashew nut prices. Just look at the growth in that trade. By August, India 868,000 tons. By August, Vietnam 2.3 million tons. These are figures that were only been dreamt about even 5 years ago. So we have a complex outlook in the market right now. We have a situation where we have the stocks at destination, improving demand, but buyers are being very cautious. And essentially, they're saying, why should we move? We'll move when everyone else does. So for a lot of buyers, especially price-conscious buyers, it's not so much important that they get the cheapest price. What's important for buyers in those situations, so let's talk about buyers in price-sensitive areas, private label, big in the United States. Private label packing done by tender, you need to be very, very efficient in your buying and on your pricing. So what's important for those buyers is not so much that they get the lowest price, but just that they get the same price or a lower price than their competitors. So there's no incentive really to buy just because prices are low. because they're low for everyone. So we'll often hear buyers say at the moment, well, why should we move? Let's wait till everyone else does. Sometimes when that happens, of course, everyone moves and the market shoots up. But there's no prospect of that at the moment, in my opinion. The other side of it is the uncertainty, the economic factors, energy prices. So we have a really complex outlook here. In many ways, the signals are that the market is becoming healthier, demand is improving, and prices should improve. But on the other side, there are enough factors right now to discourage buyers from following the market. And within the next 2 to 3 months, they'll start to say, well, you know what, we'll wait and we'll see what the crop prospects are in the Northern Hemisphere. What would change that? The weather. If we got the prospect of a poor crop, particularly in Cambodia or Vietnam, that would change everything, and the market then might turn around. But for now, it looks to me, by the way, I think Kernels prices will move up, but I think that will be slow, and I think it will be step by step. So I'm optimistic for next year. And I'd like to leave you with some kind of optimism. And I picked up this article in Snacks magazine during the week. So this is the autumn edition of Snacks magazine. Snacks magazine is the magazine of the European Snack Association. Covers all kinds of snack foods, very interesting. And they have some very good articles on the long-term impact. I just picked out a few quotations from an article on demand for snacks, not specifically nuts, but snacks including nuts. And looking at them, so they're talking about demand being resilient. They said, yeah, of course, and we know in the cashew business, it has been impacted by inflation and cost, but they expect that the volume will be regained by 2024 and growth trends will resume. So that suggests what we're seeing now in the import statistics in Europe is an indicator of what's to come next year. Secondly, and thinking a little bit more longer term, they're saying that snack makers are unperturbed by the blip. And blip is a word that means it's short term and it changes quickly. But they're unperturbed. They're not worried about this blip in nut sales in 2022, 2023, and they're looking forward to the long-term healthy eating appeal of nuts. So these factors, healthy eating, which really fits well with nuts, really fits well with cashew nuts, really significant factors as we look to the longer term. So we can remain optimistic that demand will return to strong growth in Europe and probably in North America, as it has already done in Asia. Third factor, and this is especially for all of our African processors, you need to keep focus on this. Research indicates, and this is, I think, research done by Euromonitor, that more than half of consumers in Europe are willing to pay extra for food that helps solve global issues. So that means global issues such as climate change, global issues such as the carbon footprint of an industry, labor practice, food shortages. If you're a cashew processor anywhere, but particularly if you're in an African country, you're in a great position to be part of that trend. So really optimistic news, but that doesn't mean that next week or the week after or next month we're going to see a big positive change in the market. Change will come slowly in this case, but there is a pretty positive outlook in the longer run.